Hi, this is Dr. Smith, and this is a workshop on writing a poetry explication essay. So we're going to cover three main areas in today's workshop. The first is, what is an explication essay? The second is, how do I approach a poem? And the third is, how do I write the essay? So what is an explication essay? An explication essay is also known as a close reading essay. It's an essay that explains a poem to the reader. And actually, I'm assuming that your assignment is going to be an explication of a poem, but you can actually explicate any text. So it would be possible to be assigned an explication in a class where the text wasn't poetry, but most commonly, they're on poems. But the thing that's important about an explication is that it explains a text. It's also sometimes called a close reading essay. So, assuming again that we're talking about a poem, it makes clear what the poem is about, what's the topic, and what the poem has to say about that topic. The essay then explains to the reader how you know that that's what the poem is about. How does that get communicated? You explain how it all works. And again, it's also called a close reading essay. It's an essay that really looks in with close focus. So how do I approach a poem? Your teacher is likely going to go over this with you, so this is just some additional suggestions and some highlights. So I suggest that you read the poem several times, right? When you read a poem, you read it again and again to think through the poem. I suggest that you start with the literal meaning of the poem. So on its most literal sense, what is happening here? To sort of nail down the literal meaning before we then start thinking about additional senses and additional ways that it works. Look up any words that are unfamiliar, of course, and also not just words that are unfamiliar, but words that might be operating in slightly new or slightly different or less familiar ways. So I suggest that you use the OED, that's the Oxford English Dictionary, when you work on poetry. That is available online through the library. You can type a word in there and it will give you the definition. The reason why I like using the OED is that if the poem is an older poem, the Oxford English Dictionary will tell you what that word meant when the poem was written, instead of, contemporary dictionaries just tell you what that word means today. So again, you can get access to the OED through the library. It's an electronic resource. Okay, so anyways, after looking up words, list for yourself what you understand about the poem. Also list questions and things that you're uncertain about. Are there things that you need to think a little bit more about? Things that you need to ask your instructor to clarify? And then also think about the form. What is the form of this poem and how does it relate to the content of the poem? So here are some literary elements for when you're thinking about approaching the poem. Your instructor is likely to give you a list of these as well, but you can think and talk about items like imagery, figurative language, diction, tone, sound, and rhythm. When you move through the poem, you can ask yourself, are there any images in here? And if so, list those out, and you can name them specifically in your essay and talk about what they are and what they mean and how they work, right? And so forth through this list. You can work on identifying and pointing out what they're doing in the poem. So after you've done this work of reading through the poem, sort of taking it apart and thinking about its different elements, it's time to free write. And I think that you should free write by answering the question, what is this poem about? What is its topic or subject? And what does it communicate or say about that topic? Then go back after you've answered this question and reread the poem, checking your statement against the poem. Make sure it holds up and that what you've written really does apply to the poem in general. So now it's time to write the essay. So what you want to do is you want to read the prompt carefully, right? Make sure that it's clear all of the specific things that your instructor is requiring and what they're asking you to do in the explication essay. So for example, are there requirements in terms of when or how often you quote, how long is it supposed to be, things like that. You want to start with a solid sense of the poem, right? After you've sort of worked through and thought about what it's saying, how it's saying it. And you want to start with an introduction and thesis statement. I'm going to talk about those next. So the introduction needs to introduce the poem and the topic of the poem briefly to the reader. So, name the poem, name the author, what is the poem about in the most general sense, and then moving into your thesis. The thesis states what the poem is communicating. What is the topic and what does it say about the topic? And then, of course, check this against any special instructions from your instructor in terms of what they're looking for in their intro and thesis. Here's a sample, a sort of broken up sample for thinking about writing the introduction for an explication. And so it sort of breaks, what I'm about to show you breaks up the introduction into types of movements and gives you an example for each. So the first sentence of your introduction can be a statement that announces the paper's subject, like the one here. Walt Whitman's poem, A Noiseless Patient Spider, engages its readers in its description of a spider building a web. So there's the topic. It's a poem about a spider building a web. The next sentence could move into a question asked or an issue related to what you had just said about the topic. So here are two examples, two possibilities. But readers of the poem often wonder, how does this spider relate to the speaker? Or how could this spider be significant to a human? Or instead, you could try this. The poem contemplates the world of a spider and of a human soul at the same time. Then moving to another statement relating to either the question or issue that you just had in your intro. Understanding the connection between the two, spider and speaker, is essential to fully appreciating the message of the poem. And now you're set up to offer your thesis. And again, I suggest that your thesis for an explication be your statement of what the poem is saying. Indeed, in this poem, the spider reminds the speaker of his own position in the world as isolated from it and encourages the speaker to continue to try to build bridges or connections to others, even if it seems futile. So here are all of those pieces together. So this is just a sample. It's just a suggestion for a way to think about an introductory paragraph for an explication where we identify the poem, name the poet, give a brief sense of what the topic is and what the poem is doing with this topic. Again, you'll want to check this against the specific expectations of your instructor for your assignment. So often students want to know, how do I write this essay? How do I just organize it? There are a couple of options. One is you can move chronologically through, that is, through the way that the poem works, right? So depending on how long, of course, your poem is, maybe your first body paragraph is about the first 2 lines, and your next body paragraph is about lines 3 and 4, and then your next paragraph is lines 5 and 6, or etc. But sort of moving through in the order that the poem moves. Another option is to move by topic or subtopic, where you have a paragraph on imagery and a paragraph on figurative language and a paragraph on diction. So that's another option. I think that the chronological option works best for me. It helps me organize my thoughts best and keeps me from repeating myself. The subtopic option can lead you to where you really have to pay attention that you don't repeat, that you don't end up, continuing to say the same point as you move through. But I think either works, and you should check with your professor if your professor has some specific expectations in terms of organization. You do want to make sure that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that your conclusion concludes the essay as a whole and is not just a discussion of the last 2 lines, right? So the body paragraphs are where you talk in focus about the lines of the poem, and the introduction introduces and the conclusion concludes the essay as a whole. So here we're going to talk about what we do with evidence. So the bread and butter of the explication essay is looking and talking about evidence. And so you want to really pay attention to making sure that you have lots of evidence in your paper and that you use it well. You want to quote just what you're going to be discussing at a time. So sometimes in papers we quote a big chunk and talk about that big chunk. The texture of a poetry explication essay is different. We quote in smaller pieces at a time and then talk about that small piece and then move on to the next small piece. You're going to want to cite by the line number of the poem. Discuss and explain each quotation as you go. For each quotation, you want to make sure that it's introduced, explained, discussed, and cited. So take your time with your quotations as you move through. For a review of incorporating quotations into your work, here are the page numbers for the most recent Easy Writer. If you have a different edition of Easy Writer, or if you have a different resource that you use for your handbook, they are often, if you look up in the index, you want to look up integrating sources or incorporating sources, and they will take you to some pages with some helpful tips on how to take those quotations and put them into your essay, including lists of things called signal phrases. Signal phrases are words that help you introduce a quotation. Okay, so this is hopefully a reminder. It's some specific rules for quoting poetry. So MLA asks if you're quoting 3 or fewer lines that you put them in the text of your paragraph and not as a block quote. You separate these lines with a space, slash, and another space that way can acknowledge what those original lines and punctuations looked like. I'll show you an example on the next slide. When you're quoting 4 lines or more of poetry in MLA, you indent them 10 spaces from the left margin and you make a block quotation, and you keep the structure of the poem. So you hit return at the end of the line where the poem ends the line, and then you start again 10 spaces in. With a block quotation, you don't use quotation marks at the beginning and end. These rules are in the Easy Writer, but they're also in, if you have a different grammar handbook, they'll be in there as well. Rules for quoting from a poem is what you would want to look at. So here's an example of a paragraph that incorporates a quotation or quotations from a poem and talks about them. Take a look at the section there in bold. That's to help you see. You wouldn't normally have it in bold, but that's to help you see the space slash space to see that when you're quoting from 2 lines there, what that would look like. Okay, so again, we're introducing the quotation, we're incorporating the quotation correctly, and then we're talking about the quotation. What is happening here? What does it mean? Okay, so we've finished now. We've talked about what an explication essay is. We've talked about how to approach a poem, and we've talked about how to think about writing the essay. For further resources, there is, of course, the Writing Center, your prompt, your class lessons, your instructor and office hours, and then your Easy Writer if you have it, or whatever your grammar handbook is. So I hope that this was helpful, and good luck on your essay.